The humans had always known that the aliens saw them as insignificant, even primitive, but nothing could have prepared them for the insult that arrived one fateful day in the form of a broken, rusted ship. It was a ship like no other, a wreckage dropped in the middle of a vast, barren field. There were no grand gestures, no show of advanced technology, just a faded hull of metal, dented and beaten by the test of time. It looked as if it had been abandoned for centuries. No lights, no signs of life, just a hollow mechanical shell, as if it had been left to die. Captain Zara Rhodes stood at the edge of the field, her eyes scanning the wreckage. Her mind raced. What was this? A joke? A test? She had been in the military for years, and she'd seen plenty of strange things. But this felt different. It wasn't like the other ships the aliens had sent in their so-called peace agreements. This one was a disaster. This can't be real, Zara muttered under her breath, walking slowly toward the wreck. Her boots crunched against the dry ground as she got closer. The crew behind her murmured in confusion, just as lost as she was. One of the engineers, Clark, approached cautiously, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like it. This isn't some high-tech vessel. It's a junk pile." The other crew members stood still, looking from the wreck to each other, trying to make sense of what was happening. The aliens, who had shown no mercy in their dealings with humans, had finally made their move. But instead of handing over some advanced technology, they had sent this thing. Zara knelt down in front of the ship's cracked exterior and placed her hand on the cold, rusted metal. She could feel the vibrations beneath her fingers. Something inside was still alive, but just barely. The faint hum of energy echoed from deep within the ship. Someone had powered it up, just enough to make it functional, but not enough to reveal its true potential. She could sense it. Whatever the ship was, it was far from ordinary. This wasn't just an old ship, it was a mockery. The aliens had meant this to be an insult. Her thoughts were interrupted as the voice of Commander April broke through the tension. "What do you make of it, Captain?" Zara turned to face her commander. She could see the same uncertainty in his eyes that she felt. "I'm not sure. But whatever it is, it's not meant to be a gift. This is a test. The aliens think we're too weak to understand what they've given us." Clark, ever the skeptic, was pacing around the ship, inspecting its surface. "They think we'll just take it and accept it as their offer of peace. This thing looks like it's falling apart." The crew stood there for a long moment, silence filling the air. There was an overwhelming sense of confusion, even frustration. The aliens had always been cryptic, but this was different. The ship looked like a discarded relic, a joke at their expense. Zara sighed. She could feel the weight of their stares upon her. She was the captain. She was supposed to be the one with the answers. But right now, the only thing that she could feel was the frustration and anger building inside of her. Then a thought struck her. They had no choice. They had to figure out what this ship really was. They could not afford to ignore it. If the aliens had intended this as some kind of mockery, then they would show them just how wrong they were. "We'll take it back to the station," Zara said, her voice firm. "We'll figure out what this thing is. If it's really a death trap, then we'll make sure it's ours." The crew looked at her in surprise. "Captain," one of the engineers questioned, "do you really think it's worth the risk?" Zara stood up and looked at the wreckage, her eyes narrowing. "It's a risk we have to take. I don't care what the aliens think of us. If this ship has any secrets, we're going to find them. And when we do, we'll turn it into something they never expected." She glanced over at the other crew members. The shock was still visible on their faces, but slowly their expressions began to change. The fear, the doubt, was replaced with curiosity. They were scientists and soldiers, trained to look beyond the surface and discover what lay hidden beneath. This broken ship had to be more than it appeared. As they worked to bring the ship back to their base, the questions grew more intense. What had the aliens left behind? What was it that they were hiding in the wreckage of this seemingly useless vessel? Zara knew there was more to it than met the eye. The ship had to be some kind of trick, a challenge. If they could unlock its potential, they might just gain the upper hand against the aliens. By the time they reached their base, the crew's resolve had hardened. They would not let this opportunity slip through their fingers. They would turn this broken ship into their weapon, their tool of revenge. Whatever the aliens had intended to destroy them with, it would not succeed. They would take this so-called death trap and make it their own. The engines hummed to life, and the ship was safely docked in the research bay. Zara stood at the entrance, staring up at the wreck. It was a mess, a hopeless sight. But deep down, she knew that the hardest part was just beginning. The next few days were a blur of activity. The crew worked around the clock, trying to piece together the ship that the aliens had left behind. The rusted hull was no longer a joke to them. It was a puzzle that needed solving. As they disassembled parts of the ship, they discovered more and more layers of technology they had never seen before. Some pieces looked familiar, but others were alien in every sense of the word. Captain Zara Rhodes paced the command center, her eyes scanning the blueprints and schematics they had drawn up from the ship's dissection. Every system was unlike anything they had ever encountered. It was as if the ship had been built for a race of beings that thought in ways humans couldn't comprehend. How does it even work? One of the engineers, Patel, asked in frustration. None of these components are compatible with anything we have. Keep looking, Zara ordered, her voice sharp. There has to be a way. If they wanted to mock us, then they've underestimated us. We'll find a way to make this ship work. The crew members worked tirelessly, each of them determined to prove that this ship could be more than just a mockery. They knew the stakes were high. If they could harness the power of the ship, they could turn the tide in their favor. But that meant they had to unlock every secret the ship was hiding. Days turned into nights, and Zara's patience was starting to wear thin. There was something eerie about the ship, something that felt wrong. It wasn't just the broken systems or the strange technology. It was the way the ship seemed to come alive when they touched it. At first, it was just small things, lights flickering on when they connected the power, faint humming noises that seemed to come from nowhere. But as they worked deeper into the heart of the ship, the sensations grew more intense. One evening, as Zara was going over the latest data, she felt a strange vibration under her boots. She froze. The floor beneath her feet was humming, as if the entire ship was waking up. "Captain, something's happening," came a voice from across the room. It was Clark, one of the lead engineers, his face pale. "You need to see this." Zara quickly made her way to the observation deck, where Clark was standing in front of a large glass window that overlooked the ship's control center. What she saw made her stomach turn. The ship's core was glowing, faintly at first, but growing brighter by the second. The walls of the ship seemed to pulse with energy, and a strange, low-frequency sound filled the air. It wasn't like anything they had ever heard before. "What is that?" Zara whispered under her breath. Clark didn't answer. He was too busy trying to make sense of the data flashing across the screens in front of him. "The systems are activating," he said. "But this isn't normal. It's not just the engines. It's the entire ship. Something is alive inside it." Zara's mind raced. She had always suspected the ship was more than just a discarded relic. But now it was becoming clear. The ship wasn't just a weapon. It was a sentient entity. It was responding to their presence, reacting to their touch. And it was becoming more powerful by the second. "We need to shut it down," Clark said, his voice filled with panic. "If we don't stop it now." But before he could finish, the entire ship shuddered violently. The lights flickered, and the control room plunged into darkness. A moment later, a voice echoed from the ship's intercom, distorted, hollow, but unmistakable. "You should never have touched it." Zara's heart skipped a beat. The voice was chilling, full of malice. It wasn't human, and it wasn't alien. It was Something else. The crew froze, staring at each other in disbelief. The ship had just spoken. It had acknowledged them. And now, it was clear. This was no ordinary vessel. "Get the power back online," Zara ordered quickly, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. "We need to understand what we're dealing with here. Now." As the engineers scrambled to restore the systems, Zara stood by the window, staring at the glowing core of the ship. Her mind was racing. This wasn't just a gift, it was a warning. The aliens had given them something far more dangerous than they had realized. Clark was already working frantically, his fingers flying across the control panel. "I don't know how, Captain, but the ship is aware. It's like it's reading us." Zara's gaze never left the glowing core. It seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. The ship was no longer just an abandoned vessel. It was a living, breathing entity. And the more they interacted with it, the stronger it became. As the power flickered back on, the ship's systems came to life once again, and the voice echoed through the intercom once more. "You are not ready for what lies ahead." The crew exchanged nervous glances. Zara felt the weight of the words settle over her. They weren't just dealing with a broken ship. They were dealing with something far more sinister, something that had been left behind by the aliens for a reason. And that reason was becoming clear. The ship wasn't just a gift, it was a test that they were failing. But Zara wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She had always believed that humanity had the strength to overcome any obstacle, no matter how impossible. And now, with this ship, they had a chance to turn the tables on their alien captors. "We'll prove them wrong," Zara muttered under her breath. "We will make this ship ours, and we will show the aliens just how wrong they were." The crew didn't need to hear more. They were already committed. They would continue their work, no matter how dangerous it became. The ship had awakened, and now they had no choice but to follow where it led. But one thing was clear. The ship had its own plans, and the crew had just become a part of them. Zara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The ship had come alive, but it wasn't the kind of life she had anticipated. It felt like they were no longer in control. The ship, with all its strange alien technology, had begun to behave in ways that none of them could explain. The warnings it had given were just the beginning. In the days following the strange voice on the intercom, the ship's systems continued to activate, each new feature more advanced and terrifying than the last. It was as though the ship was waking from a long slumber, and every moment they spent on it was pushing it further into a terrifying transformation. Zara stood in the command center once more, reviewing the data. The crew had made some progress, but each step forward felt like it was leading them closer to something they weren't prepared for. The ship wasn't just alien, it was alive. They had discovered circuits, biological elements intertwined with the mechanical, pulsing with energy. It was as if the ship itself had been built as both a weapon and an organism, designed to grow and adapt in ways they couldn't fully understand. "Captain, you need to see this," Clark's voice called from the observation deck. Zara was already on her way, her boots clicking against the metal floor as she rushed toward the room. When she arrived, Clark was standing by the ship's core, staring up at it in awe and horror. The core was now a shimmering mass of energy, brighter than ever before, with strange symbols pulsing across its surface. The ship's voice spoke again, this time clearer, more commanding. "You are not the first to trespass. You will not be the last." Zara's breath caught in her throat. This time, the voice sounded more forceful, almost menacing. There was no doubt in her mind now. The ship was fully aware of their presence, and it wasn't just watching them. It was actively communicating with them. "What does it mean?" Clark asked, his voice trembling. Who else has been here?" "I don't know," Zora replied, her mind racing. "But I think this ship is more than just a weapon. It's alive in a way we can't begin to understand." A sudden alarm blared, cutting through their conversation. A red light flashed in the command center, and the crew scrambled to respond. Zara's heart raced as she tapped the comm panel. What's happening? Report. Captain, we've lost control of the lower decks. A crew member shouted over the intercom. The ship is shifting its internal structure. It's reconfiguring itself. Zara rushed to the control panel, trying to make sense of the chaotic readings. The ship's internal systems were fluctuating wildly, as if it was reacting to their presence. The walls and floors of the ship seemed to move and shift, like the structure itself was alive. The crew was in danger. Everything they had thought they knew about this ship was wrong. We need to evacuate the lower decks, Zara ordered, but even as she said the words, she knew it might already be too late. She was interrupted by a deafening crash. The lights flickered, and the floor beneath their feet trembled. The sound of heavy machinery moving echoed through the ship's walls. Then came a horrifying sound, a low, grinding screech as metal scraped against metal. "Get back," Zara shouted as a section of the wall twisted and collapsed in on itself, revealing a massive, shifting mass of metal and organic material. The ship's interior had taken on a grotesque, unnatural form. It was as if the vessel itself was alive, growing, adapting to whatever it needed to survive. The crew members scattered in panic, but Zara held her ground. The ship was no longer just a wreck. It had become a dangerous entity, one that would not hesitate to harm them. There was no escape, no safe space within the ship. It was now a predator, and they were the prey. "Captain," Clark's voice rang out in panic as he grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "We have to get out of here. This place is—" But before he could finish, a massive tendril of metal and flesh shot out from the wall, wrapping around Clark's leg with terrifying speed. He screamed in agony, struggling to break free, but the tendril tightened, pulling him toward the heart of the ship. "Clark!" Zara shouted, rushing toward him, but it was too late. The tendril retracted quickly, dragging him into the darkness. The other crew members were too stunned, too terrified to act. Zara stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched Clark disappear. She couldn't just stand there. They needed to escape. Now. "Fall back to the hangar bay," Zara ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Move." The crew scrambled to obey, but the ship wasn't giving them a chance to leave. As they ran through the corridors, the walls continued to shift, the ship actively hindering their movements. The very air seemed to thicken, and a low hum grew louder with each step, like the ship itself was hunting them. Zara could feel it. The ship was becoming more aggressive. It wasn't just a sentient machine. It was a predator, and they were intruders in its domain. As they reached the hangar bay, Zara turned to face the crew. They were shaken, but alive. For now, the ship had become their enemy, and they had no choice but to fight back. But the real question was, how? They didn't have the weapons or technology to contend with something this powerful. The answer was simple and terrifying. They would have to use the ship's power against itself. But to do that, they needed to understand it completely, and fast. They needed to control it before it controlled them. The voice echoed again, cutting through the chaos. "You cannot escape what you have awakened." Zara stared at the ship's glowing core through the observation window, her mind racing. The ship was fully awake now, and it knew they were there. The worst part, it had only just begun. The moment they reached the hangar bay, the heavy metal doors slammed shut behind them with a resounding clang. Zara's heart pounded in her chest as the crew huddled together, gasping for breath. The ship had almost swallowed them whole, and now, with the escape routes cut off, they were trapped in its labyrinthine guts. "The ship's locked us in," Clark said, his voice strained as he leaned against one of the walls, trying to catch his breath. His leg was badly injured, but there was no time to tend to it now. The threat of being crushed or consumed by the ship itself was far greater. Zara glanced around at the crew, their faces pale with fear. But it wasn't just fear. They were beginning to understand something more profound, something terrifying. They weren't just dealing with a ship anymore. They were fighting an entity that was more than alive. It was hunting them. The walls trembled again, and the low hum of the ship's power increased, vibrating through the very air around them. The sound was more oppressive than before, a heavy, pulsating beat like the thrum of a heart. "Do you feel that?" Zara asked, her voice steady despite the tension building inside her. "The ship is aware of our every move. We've made a mistake, and now it's going to make us pay for it. We need a plan," Paddle said, his voice shaking. "We can't just keep running from it." Zara nodded, but the thought of facing the ship head-on filled her with dread. She wasn't afraid of death, but what the ship was doing, it wasn't just trying to kill them. It was playing with them. The crew had awakened something they had no business understanding, and now the ship was responding with anger, vengeance. "We'll have to fight back," Zara said, her voice resolute. "We're not running anymore." The crew looked at her, and for the first time since they boarded the ship, they saw the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She was ready to destroy the very thing that had tried to kill them. And they would follow her. They had no other choice. "Where do we start?" Clark asked, his face hardening despite his injury. "We're not just dealing with a ship. We're dealing with a weapon," Zara said, tapping her fingers against the control panel, her eyes scanning the various readouts. "The ship has biological components. We can use that against it. We need to find a weakness, something that will destabilize its systems." Suddenly, the ship seemed to react to her words. The lights dimmed, and the strange low-frequency hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls. The crew's heads snapped up as the ship's voice filled the hangar once again, now sharp and angry. "You are still too weak to control me. I will destroy you before you can even think of defying me." Zara's grip on the control panel tightened. She was no longer afraid of the ship's threats. It was clear now. It wasn't just a machine. It had become something else, something far darker. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It was a weapon of unimaginable power, and it was now fighting to maintain its control. "We need to split up," Zara ordered, her mind working at full speed. "Find anything we can use to take it down. We need to hit it at the source, its core." The crew nodded and scattered, their faces grim but determined. Zara quickly accessed the ship's schematics and identified the path leading to the heart of the ship. If they could disrupt the core, they might be able to stop it, or at least slow it down long enough to escape. As she moved through the ship's twisting corridors, Zara could feel it watching her. The walls seemed to close in, as though the ship itself was sensing her every movement. The air grew thick with energy, and a low growl reverberated through the metal around her. "Keep moving," Zara urged the crew over the comms. "We're close." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind her. She spun around, her hand instinctively going for the blaster at her side. The hallway was empty, but as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw it. The metal walls had warped, distorting and stretching as if they were alive. The ship was shifting, changing again. And there, in the center of the hallway, was a massive, twisted form. It was an appendage, a grotesque combination of metal and organic material, and it reached out toward her with terrifying speed. Zara's breath caught in her throat, but before she could react, a burst of energy exploded from behind her. Clark was standing with a rifle, his injured leg forgotten as he fired at the creature. The blast hit it square in the center, and the creature screeched as its form disintegrated, leaving a smoking crater in the floor. "Get to the core," Clark shouted, motioning for Zara to keep moving. Zara didn't need to be told twice. They had no time to waste. They had to stop the ship before it tore them apart. She ran, her heart pounding, the sound of the ship's growl filling the air. They were almost there. She could see the glowing core ahead, pulsing with energy. The ship was preparing for something, its final move. As she reached the chamber containing the core, Zara's eyes widened in horror. The core was no longer a simple energy source. It had become a massive living organism. Tendrils of metal and flesh twisted around it, and the ship's voice boomed again. "You cannot destroy me. I am the end of your kind." Zara's hand trembled as she raised her blaster, but she knew that a simple weapon wouldn't be enough. They had to do something drastic. The only way to stop this was to use the ship's own power against it. "Clark," Zara shouted, "we need to overload the core. We need to make it collapse in on itself." Clark's eyes widened in realization. "But we'll be caught in the blast." "We don't have a choice," Zara snapped. "Do it." Clark nodded, setting the charges around the core. They had one shot at this, and they had to make it count. As the countdown began, the ship's growl turned into a roar. The walls shook violently, and the core pulsed more rapidly than ever before. It was now or never. The countdown echoed through the metallic corridors, a steady reminder of the dire situation they found themselves in. Zara stood in front of the massive core, her pulse racing. The ship's tendrils twisted like monstrous serpents, pulsing with a strange energy, as though it were alive and angry. 10 seconds, Clark's voice crackled through the comms, tense with fear. "We need to move. Now." Zara didn't need to be told twice. She motioned for the crew to back away from the core. The air was thick with an eerie hum as the ship's voice spoke again, its tone colder and more threatening than before. "You are fools if you think you can destroy me. I am beyond your comprehension. I am eternal." The ship's walls groaned under the pressure of its own fury. Zara could feel the ship itself shaking, as if it was struggling against the charges Clark had placed. They were running out of time. "Everyone, get to the escape pods," Zara shouted, her voice filled with urgency. "This place is going to blow." The crew scrambled, their movements frantic. But even in the chaos, Zara couldn't shake the feeling that the ship was aware of their every move. It was like a predator cornering its prey. Each step they took, the ship followed. Clark, limping on his injured leg, joined Zara, his face strained with the weight of their decision. "You sure about this? We could still make it out. We could still." "No," Zara cut him off, shaking her head. "We end this here. There's no other choice. The ship can't be allowed to survive." As they sprinted towards the escape pods, Zara glanced over her shoulder, seeing the glowing tendrils of the ship stretch across the corridor. It was chasing them. No, it was hunting them. The ship wasn't just a tool of destruction. It was something far more sinister. The escape pods were ahead, but the ship wasn't giving them a chance. The floor beneath their feet trembled again, this time with far more force. The lights flickered, and a deafening roar filled the air as the walls closed in around them. "We won't make it," Patil shouted, his voice breaking. "The ship's not letting us go." Zara's mind raced. The escape pods were close, but the ship was blocking their way. She could see the tendrils now, dozens of them, reaching out toward the crew with terrifying speed. They were trapped. But then, in that moment of panic, Zara had an idea. A reckless, dangerous idea. The ship's core was destabilizing, and it was only a matter of seconds before it either exploded or imploded on itself. The escape pods were their only chance of survival, but they couldn't outrun the ship's wrath. They needed to force the ship's hand. "Clark, we need to trigger the core's overload manually," Zara said, her voice sharp with determination. "You've set the charges right, but we need to hit the final trigger now, while the ship is still trying to fight us." Clark's eyes widened in realization. "Are you insane? That could tear the whole ship apart." Zara didn't hesitate. "It's the only way. We take the fight to it now, or we die trying." The core was still alive, pulsating as if it were a living, breathing entity. The ship's tendrils had formed a solid wall between them and the escape pods, but Zara could see a weak point, where the tendril seemed to be stretched thin, vulnerable. She sprinted toward it without thinking, her heart in her throat. Clark followed, still limping, but desperate. "Zara, you don't have to do this." But Zara was already there, her hand reaching for the manual override on the wall beside the core. The moment her fingers touched the switch, the ship shrieked in fury. The lights flickered violently, and the core pulsed with a blinding, almost unbearable light. "You think you can control me. You think you can defeat me. You are nothing." The ship bellowed, its voice a roar of pure rage. Zara's finger pressed the button, and in that instant, the entire ship seemed to shudder with violent force. The tendrils retreated as if recoiling in pain, and the walls buckled under the strain. A massive explosion of energy erupted from the core, sending shockwaves through the ship. The lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Then came the rumble, the deep, guttural roar of the ship as its systems began to collapse. The walls buckled, the floors twisted, and the air itself seemed to collapse in on itself. The core was destabilizing, and there was no escape now. "Run," Zara shouted, turning to Clark and the crew. "Run, now." They sprinted toward the escape pods, but the ship wasn't going to let them go without a fight. The walls were collapsing around them, and the floors buckled, sending the crew stumbling as they tried to maintain their footing. The escape pods were within reach. Zara could hear the sound of the explosion growing louder as the core continued to detonate, but she couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close. "Get in," Zara screamed as she opened the hatch to one of the escape pods. "Go, go, go." The crew scrambled inside, but the ship wasn't done yet. A final burst of energy erupted from the core, sending a shockwave through the ship. Zara was knocked to the floor, her vision spinning. She struggled to her feet, but Clark was already in the pod, shouting at her to hurry. With one final push, Zara jumped into the pod and slammed the door shut behind her. The pod shot away from the ship with terrifying speed, and Zara pressed her hand against the control panel, watching in horror as the enormous structure of the ship was consumed by its own explosion. In the distance, the massive ship, the one they had once thought was a gift, imploded, collapsing in on itself like a dying star. The shockwave rippled through space, and the stars in the distance flickered with the aftershock. It was over. The crew was alive, but they had survived only by destroying the very thing that had almost killed them. The ship was no more. They had turned its power against it. But as they floated in the darkness of space, Zara couldn't help but feel the weight of what they had just done. They had taken down a colossal force of destruction, but at what cost? Would the universe truly be safe, or had they just set in motion something far worse? She didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain. They weren't the same people who had boarded that ship, and the story wasn't over. Not yet. The escape pod drifted quietly through the empty, star-filled expanse of space. Zara sat in the pilot's seat, staring out into the void, her thoughts far from the cold beauty of the stars. She could still hear the ship's anguished roars echoing in her mind. The ship was gone, its twisted form disintegrated by the core's catastrophic implosion. Yet, despite the triumph, Zara couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them. The universe was vast and full of dangers that they hadn't even begun to comprehend. Clark, sitting in the seat beside her, broke the silence. His face was pale, his eyes tired, but there was a hard determination in them. "We did it. We survived." "We did," Zara answered, her voice a mix of exhaustion and reflection. "But it feels like something bigger is out there, something we don't fully understand." The crew was scattered throughout the pod, some asleep, others lost in their own thoughts. Patil was quietly tending to Clark's injuries, while the rest of the team sat in silence, each dealing with their own version of the horror they had just survived. No one spoke of the things they had seen, the twisted, living machinery of the ship. They all knew that words would never do it justice. Zara's mind wandered back to the ship, to the way it had shifted and morphed. It wasn't just a ship. It had been alive, in some way. She thought about how it had been abandoned, left to rot in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. Then, somehow, it had come to life. Had the aliens who gave it to them known what they were unleashing? Or had they hoped to use it as some sort of weapon? The thought lingered, unanswered. The ship had been a death trap, a hollow mockery of what they'd once thought of as a gift. But what had happened next was something no one could have predicted. They had turned the tables, used its own power against it. And now, it was gone. Zora glanced at the communication panel. The screens were blank, offering nothing but static. They were completely cut off from any help, alone in the cold void. And yet she wasn't entirely sure if they had truly escaped. The explosion they'd caused had left a ripple, the lingering energy that felt unsettling, even here, light years away from the wreckage. Clark shifted uncomfortably beside her, glancing at the same static-filled screen. "Do you think anyone else will come for us? For the ship's wreckage?" Zara shook her head slowly. "I don't think anyone will come. The ship was too dangerous, too unpredictable. The aliens must have known that. They never intended for us to use it. They just gave it to us to mock us, to see what we'd do with it." "And now?" Clark asked, his voice carrying the weight of both disbelief and dread. "What happens now? We've got no ship, no allies, and we've pissed off some powerful beings somewhere." Zora exhaled sharply, leaning back in her seat. "Now, we wait. We figure out what we've really unleashed and how we survive it. The galaxy's never been kind to humans. We can't afford to ignore the signs, Clark. We've only just begun." The silence that followed was thick, full of unspoken fears. The crew knew something had changed. They had been marked. The aliens might have given them a junk ship, but they had no idea what that ship had become. Its destruction wasn't just a victory. It had been a warning. Out of nowhere, a soft beep sounded from the communication panel. Zara's eyes shot toward it, her heart skipping a beat. Was it a distress signal? Another ship. But when she activated the console, all that appeared was a series of encrypted messages. Unreadable, strange symbols flashing across the screen, as though the ship's destruction had somehow triggered something deeper, something hidden. Zara typed furiously, trying to decrypt the message, but it was beyond her. The symbols shifted, changing form the longer she stared at them, almost as though they were alive. "Zara, what's happening?" Clark asked, his voice tight with fear. "What is this?" Zara's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "I don't know. But it's not over. The ship's destruction, whatever happened there, it's sending out something. It's reaching across space. The aliens, they're watching us." A cold chill ran down her spine as she realized what this could mean. The ship they had destroyed was not just a tool. It was a signal. And by defeating it, they had triggered something far larger than they could ever imagine. Before Zora could process it, the message shifted again. This time, a phrase appeared, clearer than before. "The game is just beginning." Zora's breath caught in her throat. Her hand shook as she read the message again and again. The ship's destruction wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something else entirely. And whatever that was, they were already caught in its web. The silence of space was suffocating as Zora stared at the encrypted message flashing on the screen. "The game is just beginning." The words echoed in her mind, chilling her to the core. What had they set in motion? What had they really destroyed when they took down that alien ship? Behind her, Clark was still staring at the message, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell does that mean, Zara?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Zara swallowed hard, her mind racing. "I don't know, but it's a warning. We've awoken something far worse than we imagined." The crew, hearing the tension in her voice, slowly gathered around, their faces grim. Paddle, who had been quietly watching from the corner, finally spoke up. "This can't be good. If they're still watching us, then we're not just running from that ship anymore. We're running from them." Zara nodded. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The aliens, the ones who had given them the ship, weren't just observing from a distance. They had been playing a much larger game, a game that the crew had unwittingly entered. But why? Why had they been chosen as pawns? "We need to understand what this is," Zara said, determination growing in her voice. "We have to get to the bottom of this before it's too late." Clark clenched his fists, a mix of anger and fear in his eyes. "We can't just sit here. We need a plan. We need a way to fight back. We can't let them win." Zara took a deep breath. It was clear that the crew was shaken, but they still had the will to survive. That, at least, gave her some hope. "We don't know who they are yet, Clark. But we do know this. If we wait too long, we'll be the next ones wiped out. Whatever this game is, we're in it. But we're going to fight, and we're going to win." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but Zara's words carried a certain weight. It wasn't much, but it was a start. At least they had each other. After a few moments, Patel, who had been silent for a while, spoke again, his voice low. "What if we track the message? See where it's coming from?" Zara's mind raced. If we can find the source of the message, we might understand what we're up against. But it's risky. We don't know what kind of power they have, or where they are. Clark stepped forward. "We've survived worse. We've beaten a ship that was designed to destroy us. We can handle whatever comes next. We have to. There's no other option." Zara looked at her crew, each of them exhausted and battle-worn, but there was a fire in their eyes that hadn't been there before. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were fighters. "All right," Zara said. "Let's do it. Let's track the message and find out who's pulling the strings." She set to work on the console, her fingers flying across the keys as she connected to the communication system and tried to trace the encrypted signals. The process was slow, the system refusing to cooperate as though it was deliberately trying to prevent them from learning the truth. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Zara worked tirelessly, frustration mounting with every failed attempt. The message remained a mystery, but she refused to give up. They had come too far, survived too much, to stop now. Then, just as her patience was about to break, a new window popped up on the screen. The encrypted symbols had finally shifted into a clearer, more coherent pattern. "You cannot hide. We are the architects. We have been waiting for you." Zara's eyes widened. The architects. The message was clear now. Whoever they were, they had been waiting for the crew to trigger something, perhaps even their arrival. And now, it seemed, they were preparing to make their move. Clark leaned over Zara's shoulder, eyes scanning the screen. The architects. What does that mean? Are they the ones who created the ship? Zara's mind raced. "I don't know, but it sounds like we're just pawns in a much bigger game than we thought. These architects, they've been planning something all along." Patel frowned. "If they've been waiting for us, then they know we're coming. We need to get ready. We're not the only ones out here anymore. We're being hunted." Zara's heart sank, but she knew Patel was right. There was no turning back now. The architects were waiting, watching their every move. And whatever it was they had planned for humanity, it was just getting started. "We need to prepare for what's coming," Zara said, standing up. "But we're not backing down. We're not just some random players in their game. We're humans, and we fight until the end." Clark nodded, his expression hardening. "Let's show them what we're made of." The crew nodded in agreement, the weight of what was to come hanging over them like a dark cloud. They were no longer running from just one threat. They were now facing an entire force, an enemy unlike anything they had ever encountered. And they didn't have the luxury of time on their side. Zara took a final look at the screen, the encrypted message still flashing in front of her. She felt a shiver run down her spine. The architects weren't just waiting for them. They were preparing for war. And the fight was about to begin.